much like yesterday's game with colors reversed with e5. And something tells me that Prag will not be essaying the 4 knights defense in this game.
It will be the Italian. I'm pretty sure that Prag goes for the Italian. Exactly, bishop c4 on the board.
Knight f6, and of course the fried liver with knight g5 has fallen out of fashion. Prag going main line with d3.
Yes, and now a4 immediately. Okay. This is a slight surprise. Usually white plays c3 or short castle first. And the main point is, I believe, pretty clear. Try to surprise your opponent as quickly as possible. Magnus is now pausing. Definitely he hasn't expected the move a4 to happen so early.
And a4 has been essentially the sine qua non of how top GMs have played the Italian recently. This move appears in almost every Italian game, but it usually appears much later, Peter. I think this is what you're saying. It usually appears
first tournament
So a4 as early as move 5, it's not unheard of. What is the idea other than the pure surprise value of delaying the move c3? Is Magnus responding in very conventional fashion there with d6? Is Prag going to put a knight on c3 potentially? Somehow I'm skeptical about that.
Yes, I think that the whole point was of a4 to try to provoke black of deciding already of going a6 or a5. However, Magnus's choice is what I'm also preferring, simply to stay flexible, not show your cards yet. And after d6 short castle, yeah, Prag says, yes, I'm not interested yet on advancing my a pawn. It was just a slight teaser, and I'm kind of asking you, yes, please decide where you want to put that a pawn as quickly as possible.
We've seen so much new life breathed into the Italian, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest opening in modern chess. It has been played regularly at the top level since the 1600s. But in the old days, both sides would automatically castle kingside. In the old days, white would play c3 followed by d4. But recently, we've seen a crop of games where black tries to go h6 and g5 and actually delays castling kingside, instead going for the quick attack on white's kingside. But often, Peter, that attack is a lot stronger when white already has a pawn on h3, because that pawn acts as a hook for black's g-pawn once it reaches g4. In this particular version, h6 followed by g5 just doesn't seem to be congruent with what Magnus wants out of this game, which I think is a solid setup with the black pieces.
For sure. Yes, the question is, on the other hand, that what is his move? Does he spend the tempo on h6, making sure that white...
That's
one question. Another question that if...
இந்த போர்டை இவங்க விளையாடுறத காட்டினா கூட பரவாயில்ல, இதை போட்டு காட்டிக்கிட்டு இவங்களுடைய ப்ரிடிக்ஷன்லாம் காட்டுறானுங்களா, எனக்கு இன்னும் விளக்கல.
He has to be confronted with bishop g5, so Magnus decides to stay flexible, and after a5, Prag immediately blitzes out the move bishop c1 to e3. That was his idea against black's a5 setup.
That's a big move. Of course, the bishop could come out to g5. Instead, it comes out to e3, offering an exchange. This is a very thematic exchange in the Italian. If black trades, what does white get in return? Well, the downside is clear. White gets the doubled pawns, but in return, white gets pressure down the f-file. The rook on f1 is going to be very happy, combining with the bishop on c4. And in some situations, of course, the knight from f3 could jump either to g5, but more commonly from h4, it seeks a nice post on f5. Black, of course, can do the same thing. Black can respond with bishop e6, but white is under no obligation to exchange the bishops in the same manner, and white can play the move knight b1 to d2, keeping the tension. We actually might see all of these moves on the board. Carlsen has exchanged, but instead of bishop e6, he has castled kingside right into the teeth of white's...
It's somewhat surprising for me. Magnus, so let's just go slowly. Magnus captures on e3, f takes e3, castles. I wanted to give a kind of explanation that maybe the reason why Prag has not played the standard c2 c3 is that he might want to develop his knight to c3. However, he goes for the conventional knight b2. Magnus blitzes out the typical knight maneuver, rerouting that knight to g6. That's the perfect square for black's knight. also making sure that all the ideas with knight h4 won't be so dangerous. And black is also setting up some c6 d5 ideas, trying to block that bishop on c4. Now the big question, however, if you know that Magnus wants to play knight g6, stopping knight h4, then there is the question, why aren't we able to do that immediately?
Knight h4 in this position, jump on the opportunity train, because once the knight reaches g6, I mean, you can play queen e1 followed by knight h4, but it won't come with the same effect. If you play knight h4 here, what I like about that move is knight g6, of course, can be met with knight to f5. And obviously the knight on f5 can be chopped off. Black can play bishop takes f5. But that's a pretty big concession. You're giving away your light squared bishop, which means that white's control over the a2 g8 diagonal is now uncontested and can only be contested by the c65 idea. So without the bishop, black often struggles to maintain the same level of control in the center. I think that knight h4 might be Prag's most testing response. I'm with you.
Yes, somehow also it fits perfectly to White's previous play. He has already doubled his pawns with the clear idea of trying to grab the initiative with knight h4. He knows exactly that give black a couple of moves, knight g6, c6, d5, and black will be the one fighting for the center and also for the upper hand. Then White's pawn structure will suddenly tell. White has to...
In order to take the stake,
Disconnected,
knight
reconnected.
f5 in this position would lead to a very unfavorable exchange for white, because it would relinquish white's control over the center and allow black to push d5 and establish ideal control over the center. White's attack, in the meantime, white's fledgling attack would go
Okay, I'm back.
nowhere, with that pawn on f5 blocking white's
There
control
was a
over the
small
upper.
connection issue.
This is out of the question.
Yes, one thing that, however, we have to address, the typical exchange sacrifice, rook takes f6, and Magnus is kind of provoking it. That gives me the feeling that clearly he anticipates the move. He feels like in this exact position I don't have to fear it, but since Prag is now closing, I believe we should be talking about this exchange sacrifice.
bro.
Takes f6, g takes f6, queen
எனக்கு
h5,
ஒரே நிமிஷம்
usually
நடுவில்
this is the way.
இன்டர்நெட் திடீர்னு வெண்ட் ஆஃப்
White
ஆச்சு
goes back to
ஐ
the
டோன்ட்
bishop
நோ
on
வை
e3, and long terms there is very serious idea with rook f1 going after black's king. But Prag has felt like no, Magnus is trying to provoke me for it. Probably White is not yet ready, and he plays according to the demands of the position. He goes for queen e1 instead.
Rook takes f6 has to be kept in mind as long as black's knight remains on e7, and it likely will remain on e7 for the time being. This is the whole crux of Magnus's strategy. If you rush the move knight g6, we've already been down that rabbit hole. White plays knight f5 and achieves the kind of ideal setup on the king side. Prag is aiming directly for g3. Once the queen reaches g3, rook takes f6 will be a direct threat. Black's king could slide over to h8, but Prag is not trying to do anything fast. He is accumulating his attack. You need to actually get your pieces to the right area of the board. Nothing in the Italian happens within 2 or 3 moves. This is a gradual process. And a big question, Peter, is whether and when Magnus will push d5, because the drawback of the move d5 is obvious.
d5 னா d தேர்றா 5 தேர்றா
Queen g3
ஓ சாமி
potentially will come with even greater effect.
Yes, queen e1 is a very nice little touch. I also somehow remember that in this type of positions, often the little quiet move h2, h3, seemingly doing nothing, giving a tempo, is also a very typical way of reinforcing the idea of going queen g3. In certain situations, it's kind of nice to control the g4 square. But for the moment, it is Magnus who has to think about how to handle the position. I'm loving the choice of Prag for the fact that Magnus has tremendous experience in the Italian in different structures. But exactly this very specific one, that White has kept the pawn on c2, and White was able to go for a very quick knight h4 followed by queen e1, queen g3, feel like this is a very fresh position.
Prag has done a monumental job this tournament of sensing in which type of position his opponent will feel most uncomfortable. And when you're talking about players like Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen, that is very, very hard to do. Against Hikaru, he responded to the move 1c4 with a principled e5. Against Magnus, in their first classical game, Pragnananda played the English opening himself
Comment
and
போடுங்க
did
boys.
manage to put
Come on.
serious pressure on Magnus Carlsen's choice of setup. Now he decides to opt for e4 and an opening that he himself is more comfortable with and more experienced with, which makes a lot of sense because in the rapid time control, one of the most important things is not only objective advantage, but also to get a position that you feel comfortable with, like putting on, an old pair of jeans. You know what to expect. And I really like Prag's opening choice. He's built up a little advantage on the clock as well. And a big decision here coming up for Magnus.
Very big decision. It's clear that his last two moves, knight e7, c6, had one clear intention of going d5. And he is posing
மண்டைக்குள்ள எவ்வளவு மூவ்ஸ் ஆன்டிசிபேட் பண்ணிட்டு ஜாலி
while we are waiting for
இப்படி
Magnus
உட்கார்ந்துட்டு
to
இருக்காங்க.
make up his mind. We can maybe just quickly check what happens after d5, bishop b3. So white falls back with the bishop. We already mentioned that yes, white will come with queen g3, targeting that pawn on e5, using the pin on the g file against the king of going for rook takes f6 ideas as well. And the most natural developing move, bishop e6, might run into queen g3 with this double attack when black might be forced to move away that knight from f6 to d7. Certainly something which you don't want to do.
And white can continue to accumulate his pieces
Yeah,
of
might be
like rook a to e1, and potentially could strike at the center himself with a well-timed d3, d4. That would lead to massive tension in the center, and lo and behold, we do have d5, bishop b3 on the board, but Carlsen responding with queen to d6, occupying the square that was left vacant by black's previous move. The queen moves up in order to protect the knight laterally and to protect the e5 pawn. It's a very logical move on the surface, but the drawback, Peter, is that after queen to g3, as we see Prag leaning over the board, I think he might be sensing that this is an opportunity to grab the initiative. Queen g3 poses serious threats against black's queen, which is undefended, and that idea I pointed out a little bit earlier, d3, d4, turns from an abstract concept into a concrete threat.
Wow. Yes, this is very interesting. So after queen g3, black has to deal with the situation. Let's just one time try the most natural move, knight g6. White has even different options. Knight f5, even in this construction, maybe knight take g6 is also possible. Let me just highlight this transformation of structure. Knight take g6, h take g6, e takes d5, c takes d5, knight f3. Attacking that pawn, black has to go rook e8, and white follows it up with knight g5, followed by queen h4, and suddenly rook takes f6, queen h7, check ideas are coming. Super dangerous stuff.
And it all starts with queen g3. That queen's
super dangerous னு சும்மா சொல்றானுங்க ப்ரெடிக்ட் பண்ணி, பட் அவன் சின்னதா ஒரு எதிர்பார்க்காத ஒரு மூவ், அது இன்னும் சூப்பர் டேஞ்சரஸா இருக்கும்.
Magnus is, again, trouble is a very strong word, and Magnus Carlsen is not often in trouble.
8 people watching.
Let's put it this way: his position seems quite a bit more uncomfortable after queen g3.
He doesn't have natural moves, and the computer actually highlights that knight h5 might be the best. It's a very strange little move because after queen g5, black actually has to fall back with the knight to f6. One doesn't get the feeling like you can afford to lose this extra tempo. And Magnus, in full concentration mode, he feels that this is a very critical position.
What's going down through Prag's head right now? He obviously sees the move queen g3. Could he be asking himself, is this true? Does Magnus have something up his sleeve? Does he have the luxury of seeing the computer assessment?
ஏன்னா அவன் மேக்னஸ் கால்சனும் சும்மா கிடையாது.
There's no way that queen g3 is as good as it looks. Well, it actually is as good as it looks. And Prag, he's been trusting himself all tournament, right? He has been believing in his own ability to approach every position in a better and superior way than even the top players in the world. Can he rely on that confidence here and play queen g3 in a timely fashion?
Queen g3.
I believe he will. First of all, I also don't really see any other move for white. Yeah, it's kind of the absolute logical follow-up. He has played the move knight h4. He has played the move queen d1 to e1 with a clear intention of going with his queen to g3. Is he bothered by this knight h5?
Yeah,
and it's on the board.
வேற வழி இல்ல.
Played it. And if knight h5 followed by retracting the f6 is the best that black can do. Well, that is a pretty bad sign for Carlsen, because doing that in any position is difficult. That is admitting that the situation is undesirable for you, that you are essentially groveling for a draw, that you are at the mercy of your opponent, who can choose to repeat the position. Of course, I think there's no way that Prag would repeat if Magnus does in fact play knight h5 and knight f6. But could Carlsen play a calmer move like rook f8 to e8, just trying to solidify the center and prepare for the eventuality that white plays d4?
But that move looks very shaky. I guess that rook e8 with the vulnerable f7 pawn, the bishop on b3, rook on f1, beautifully eyeing. I'm not seeing black going for a move like this.
I agree. It doesn't seem to do anything specific. Maybe rook to d8 in order to protect the queen and try to take this thing out of d4. Here you're highlighting e takes d5 and e4, carving open the a2 g8 diagonal. And obviously if black plays d4, everything collapses. The knight from d2 jumps into c4 and wins the e5 pawn. And man, I mean, this is how close the situation is from becoming absolutely critical. It seems like whichever Peter, you're leaving something else exposed. If you move the rook, you leave f7. If you move the bishop to c8, then you're not addressing the pin along the h2b8 diagonal. This is very problematic for Magnus.
Crucial.
Very, and we see Magnus immediately in super concentrating. He knows exactly that he can't afford one inaccuracy. The reason why it's so unpleasant for him at the moment that he has played only the most natural moves, so you can't really understand while playing the game that what went wrong. One could argue that maybe against this setup then the move knight e7 followed by c6 was too ambitious, but it's such a natural way. So after queen g3 now, I'm pretty sure that Magnus will have to spend
I think we can watch it here. It's very
that actually
good.
the move knight h5 is super ugly, but probably I have to play it. Let's just
But அது பாத்துக்கிட்டே இருக்குது வெறுப்பா இருக்குல்ல, ஏன்னா ரொம்ப நேரம் மூவ் பண்ணாம அப்படியே இருப்பாங்க.
to fall back.
ரெண்டு மாத்தி மாத்தி பார்ப்போம்.
The problem for white is it's not so easy to follow it up with a direct idea. Black also has this idea of kicking the queen away with h6, and once the queen falls back to g3, then again keep on harassing that queen. You just have to somehow unbalance the situation.
இவனுங்க உட்கார்ந்து விளையாடுறவங்க இவ்வளவு யோசிப்பாங்க, கண்டிப்பா யோசிப்பாங்க பயங்கரமா. பட் இவனுங்க உட்கார்ந்து இதுதான் மூவ் பண்ணுவாங்க, இப்படிதான் பண்ண போறானுங்கன்னு உட்கார்ந்து ஜாலியா பேசிக்கிட்டு இருக்காங்க. நானும் அது விளையாட ஆரம்பிக்கிறோம் ஆன்லைன்ல. எவ்வளவு கேம்ஸ் ஆடுறேன் விளையாடணும்.
Knight f6 to g4. I mean, one of those moves that once it's played, yeah, it looks kind of logical because you're eyeing the h2 pawn. But, you know, try finding the sequence of moves, knight h5, then knight back to f6, and then knight f6 to g4. That is a Herculean task for Magnus Carlsen, and these are the variations that might be circling around his mind right now.
Definitely. As a pawn, it also shows that he feels like he needs some new impulses. This is a very typical common reaction of any top player, that you feel like, okay, I'm nervous, I have to somehow get some new feeling for the position. It's not easy. He puts that pawn aside, gets ready for concentration, and is he about to make a move?
Not yet, and this is a 25+10 rapid game, so playing objectively is much more important than playing quickly. You have time. We've seen players successfully spend over 10 minutes per move in this time control, because keeping a reasonable position is so important. Prag still has 20 minutes on his clock, and he has made even 1 minute count and go very, very far. How will Magnus try to douse the flames of white's initiative? If there are so many threats here, so many
Magnus give him
and the best
mango
news
lassi
for Prag is that he has to
tummy
sacrifice
upset.
anything to get this position. He did it slowly, and Magnus uncorking knight h5. Wow.
I think no way he's falling for this.
Clearly, he understood that, okay, I have done all the natural moves, there has to be something in the position. He did spend a lot of time. He's under 15 minutes, and it's only move 13 in the game. This is showing that what an incredible preparation.
Come
it was
on,
from
Magnus,
Prag
please.
that managed to unbalance, unsettle Magnus right from the start.
Oh, this is going live
Magnus
on Twitch
can't
too?
relax
Nice.
for a single second.
I
He's
can't
under
watch
pressure.
it from Twitch.
And just the
So,
tension in a good sense with which Prague plays. You know, the pressure that he puts on every player is
Because, you know, like,
something else.
this is not
Honestly, very impressive
up to the
watch.
time.
Prague
So that's why I'm
blossoming
going
into
to the official
super
website and
grandmaster that
checking.
he is, and the level that he's played with for the better part of the last year. But now, finally, his rating catches up to his strength. Now, where will he put his queen? Queen to g5 is not the only move. The queen could also slide over to f3, and Carlsen's reaction to that move will likely be the same, right? He will drop back to f6. We might see Ragnar repeating the position once, but I find it very hard to believe, as I said earlier, that he will not try to squeeze more from this position than a draw.
Oh my god.
I think that knowing Prague, he will not even repeat, not once. He goes for queen g5,
Expert.
knight f6, and he will remain ambitious. He just... But okay, we talked about this, that black's only move is knight f6 according to computer. Not knowing the fact
What
that
just
this is
happened?
the best move. There are also some arguments for g6, trying to make sure that you kind of control the g3 square, and that's what Magnus goes for.
Great call, Peter. And g6, I think, is a very sensible move because you're going to follow this with the move f6, and you're going to kind of blanket White's pieces with this, with these spikes, right? These pawns on f6 and g6, which together are controlling a lot of important squares and potentially forcing White's queen to seek shelter on h4. Prag might have to move his knight back to f3 in order to open up that little window for the queen on h4, because if you slide the queen up to h6, I could conceive of some lines where that queen gets into some trouble. That might be a little bit too audacious, and I think knight hf3 satisfies the demands of the position, but Prag goes forward to f5.
Wow, quite quickly he made this decision. I was trying to highlight how do we
Oh my
trap the
god.
queen on h6
Yeah.
after f6, queen h6,
It's a
and
movement.
the only way what I find was this rook f7, king h8, knight g8,
Was
which
here?
would have run into knight h6 checkmate. So just to
Wow.
yes, just to highlight, yeah, that what a
It's
crazy
check
construction this
We
is.
can move
But
somewhere.
Prag goes instantly for knight f5. This is a move that if it works out well, we will be saying that
Yeah.
it
I
was
think
a
the
great
game
choice, putting the pressure
we
on
don't-
Magnus.
எனக்கு
very
அந்த அளவுக்கு
quickly.
யோசிக்க
On the
வராது
other
பட்
hand, if
I think
Magnus
it's
somehow manages
this
to
guy's game.
neutralize Black's White's initiative, for example, bishop takes f5, e takes f5, and then maybe king g7. Is that possible? Trying to make some control over the dark squares. Let me even put it, because I feel like this is so important. Takes, and if not for the move king g7, I feel I'm seriously under pressure. But king g7, stopping f6, and eventually setting up some kind of ideas with queen f6.
And White's attack starts to run out of steam here. That's the problem. Prag is really lacking in this position a minor piece, you know, a knight on g4, or maybe a dark squared bishop. So White could play some sort of accumulating move, like rook a to e1, for example. But if you're resorting to a move like that,
What
that
happened?
means that the worst is behind Carlsen. Did Prag rush with
Okay.
this move, knight f5? It's a
The
very
knight is
dramatic
gone, bro.
move. It's a tempting move.
He
He's
came
kind
in.
of riding the fumes of his attack, but he might have given up that knight a little bit too early, and
Bishop
you know, the ostensibly more
F5.
reserved knight f3, I think, would have kept better practical chances. Carlsen, he seems ready to make his move. He can play f6.
ரொட்டேஷன்லாம் மறந்து போச்சு
Q
QE1
D5
D5 அப்படின்னா QE queen வந்து E1 ல இருந்து
and we have grown accustomed to Magnus finding moves like king g7 on the regular.
Yes, I also feel
ரொட்டேஷன்ஸ்லாம் மறந்துச்சு
on Magnus's body language like he's relieved. He feels like, all right, yes, and king g7 on the board.
It's a huge gap for me. Chess விளையாடி
That is the desired stability
regular
for
ஆ
black, and
விளையாடுனதில்ல
especially
ரொம்ப
we are
நாள்
talking about which aren't easy to answer. Those
He
are the
came
most
down.
unpleasant things. Now, however, Magnus feels like, all right,
Oh, that was a
I have
trader.
shut that bishop out for good, because even if White follows up e4, he takes d5, c takes
Yes.
d5 is still perfectly good for black,
Yes.
covering the dark squares. The knight on pawn h5 does an extremely good job. And also the idea is threatening to play queen f6 because it puts kind of lot of pressure on the f5 pawn as well. I feel that this is maybe the first moment that Magnus is really happy with his position.
There's a very important tactical detail. Let's take a neutral move like c3 just to illustrate. After queen f6,
or then let me play rook f2, or that not good enough.
I think it does. The line still works after rook f2. I was going to say after queen f6, queen g4. In fact, rook f2 I think makes a lot of sense from White's perspective. You would like to play queen g4. You would like to keep the queens on the board. And ostensibly after knight takes f5, e4 wins the knight. But the issue is this vulnerable placement of the queen on g4. Black's knight can go forward to e3, but even safer is to go back to h6. And Black gets out of the pin, counterattacking White's queen. And look at just the heroic defensive role exerted by the king on g7, which protects the queen on f6. And that means, you know, the desperado sacrifice on h5 leads absolutely nowhere. Also, queen takes f2, and Black will emerge with an extra exchange. So this is out of the question, which means queen f6 is a major positional threat, because if the queens go off the board, I think that we might start talking about a slight advantage for Black in the endgame.
Exactly. Yes, somehow, maybe because Prag rushed too quickly with knight f5, did he simply miss the move king g7, or he did not miss the move king g7, but he forgot that there might be a threat from Black with queen f6. It could have easily been that he had foreseen the structure, because especially when you make up your mind quickly, you think about the structure and you think like, all right, I have all the time in the world to double my rooks on the f-file. Knight takes f5 is never a problem due to the pin, and I'm gonna insist on going f6. If Black ever plays the move f6, then white queen just falls back to g4, and the king side.
என்னடா யோசிப்பானுங்க பாரு நான் ஒரு மாதிரி வேன் உட்காந்துருக்கான் 293 frames dropped. Shit. Reduce this. Nothing happened. Looks like RP has micro advantage, but
that here, he might not even be worse on the board. I think it's very important, Peter, to clarify. Probably Prag is not worse here, but the trend of the game, we talked about this yesterday, the trend of the game favors Black, because Prag was just attacking, he was just paralyzing Black, and suddenly he's dealing with a very nasty positional threat. And the question of
how to use this feature you need to be able storage or
can he calm himself down and play an objective patient move like rook a to e1?
Very tough, because I also don't know exactly what does this move really do to the position. Rook a1.
Yeah.
Why? First question. Can't Black do the same to queen f6? What is the
attack for try to
no, he can't. Wow. So now queen g4, knight takes f5, e4, knight h6, and wow, just queen d7.
Ooh.
7.
Ooh. And you take the b7 pawn. But why was this move impossible in a different version? Like, why is the rook being on e1 necessary to make this move possible? Maybe it's because after queen h4, you're able to play knight d7, oh, apparently queen d8. And if you take b7, knight g4 hits the rook on f2 and generates a lightning attack on the king's side. It's the fact that the rook on f2 would be really vulnerable, whereas the rook on e1 would enable White to exert pressure on Black's side.
I never played chess here.
This line basically illustrates how difficult and complex this position is.
I'm looking at it and I still don't fully understand, Peter. Like, why rook a1 is so crucial. My guess is that we might see a queen trade. I think Prag might bite the bullet and say, listen, after queen takes f6, maybe I can quickly go e4. I find it hard to believe that White is in big game, but obviously an endgame would play right into Magnus Carlsen's biggest strength, particularly in the rapid time control.
Yeah, what comes to my mind is that what happens after e4, it looks like maybe the most natural human move if we see that we can't follow it up with rook f2. Magnus also leaning back on his chair, he definitely feels that he got stability, and this is what really matters for him. And the ball is back on
முன்னாடி
the spot.
பதட்டத்துல கொண்டு தான் இப்போ பரபரப்பா கொண்டிருக்கோம்.
The thinking time, I think, says it all. Prague is now down on is the time advantage that he built up with his excellent opening preparation. I think it's an encouraging sign that he's taking his time. It means that he senses the trend of the game has reversed in Black's direction and that it's important for him to make a stabilizing move. I'm with you, Peter. 4 is the move most grandmasters would play in a blitz game because it's thematic. You connect your pawns. Of course, you weaken the F4, but that doesn't seem particularly essential.
Yes, fighting for the center, making sure that the bishop from b3 is getting closer to the game. He takes d5 is always an idea. Then already the move rook a1 will be so much more natural. It's and Prag goes king h1. All right, he just makes a neutral move.
Okay, but queen f6 is very likely to follow, and Magnus might play that move fast because he had so much time to gather his thoughts while Prag was thinking. I feel like queen f6 forces a queen trade, and then king h1 might actually be counterproductive because in the endgame, in general, you want your king closer to the center.
This is the feeling I'm getting, that with king h1, does actually Prag signal that he completely misses Black's resource with queen f6?
It's entirely possible.
Yeah, I'm shocked for the fact, because of course, thanks to computer, we have understood queen f6 quite quickly. But assuming that he spent quite a lot of time and he did not rook f2 idea with rook af1, that's kind of surprising.
Carlsen has to find queen f6. You can also throw white's h6, but queen f6 is the kind of move that you do play. If you see the move, you play it. So the big question for Magnus is, can he calculate past queen f6, queen g4? The key thing to realize is that the pawn on f5 can be captured because you can unpin in the manner that we have previously described by dropping the knight away to h6 and counterattacking white's queen. If Magnus Carlsen sees that line, there is no question he will play queen f6. And I think that he will find that this is within his powers, very much so.
Also, look at his way of handling the situation. He senses that this is a very important moment of the game. He is in full concentration mode. There is, however, also the other option, which is kind of tempting, to play something like h6, and after queen h4, fall back with the knight to f6 with a tempo. Black moves away the queen, and the idea what I had in mind is somehow to go g6, g5, but that still at this moment runs into d4. So that's one of the reasons why this isn't as effective as queen f6.
And a queen trade would be also a psychological blow to Prag, who I think was just ready to attack, right? He was in that frame of mind where I'm going to tear this guy apart. I'm going to use my queen and generate chances against Black's king. Suddenly adjusting yourself to a slightly worse endgame, going from, you know, a one-sided attack to a long and arduous defensive task in the endgame is very, very onerous from a psychological standpoint. So
he made this.
Queen f6 is asking to be played, and he plays it. And this is a very difficult moment for the Indian talent. Will he trade queens? Will he stubbornly drop back to g4? This is not really a choice, Peter. He has to trade, and he has to accept the new reality.
Yeah, which is very unpleasant. Then he will be kicking himself of investing 5 minutes on king h1 and missing Black's idea of queen f6. This is a cold shower now for Prag. And the point is that, yes, now after queen g4, knight takes f5, there is nothing to talk about, because after e4, I guess that now even the forcing knight e3 works perfectly, making sure that white doesn't have any queen moves at all. The knight is hitting also the rook, and one of the lines that computer was highlighting with white's rook on e1 was that white can count on some idea like rook d6, but for that idea it was essential to have that rook on e1, eyeing the e5 pawn already. Here Black would just trade that intruder easily with rook d8, and Black is just a very healthy pawn up. So I don't see another way of playing with white rather than trading queens, and Prag takes his time. It's clear that he is shocked that queen f6 was possible.
every second that ticks away from his clock is a second that he could be spending trying to find the ideal defensive setup in the endgame. And I think that any defensive setup is connected to the move E3, E4. I think we will see that move. Probably he will take on G6 first. And
Queen trade happened.
Carlsen can recapture several different ways. Then I think Prag will advance his pawn to E4 and try to increase the influence of his bishop, and also to restrict the knight on E7 and prevent it from jumping to E5 and harassing that E3 pawn. How would you assess Magnus Carlsen's chances in this endgame? There's no doubt that black is probably the one pushing for a win here, but is it, 90-10? Is it 70-30 in Carlsen's favor? What's going through his mind right now?
I think that first of all, he's just very happy what happened here in the last couple of moves. He's relieved. At some point, like 15 minutes ago, it looked like he has a very tough position. Prag has the initiative. Prag is up on the clock. And yeah, Prag had to go for f take g6. Now Magnus takes h take g6, clearly capturing towards the center. And I perfectly agree with you that somehow e4 is kind of the move that you want to play. If you play e4 followed by rook a1, then eventually black's pawn on e5 will be quite vulnerable. White will have e takes d5 ideas, and it's not so easy to move that knight from e7. So there's a big question, like after e4, is black even potentially considering a trade on e4 and say that, you know what, yes, it's already on the board. Let me refresh. fg8g, e4, white is fighting for the center. And all eyes on Magnus, that does he bring the rook to d8, which gives white the chance to eventually target the e5 pawn, or is he releasing the tension but make sure that he fixes the structure?
Carlsen has shown, throughout his career, a propensity to keep the tension in the center and to try to generate problems by making the position more complex. I think rook a8 is right in his wheelhouse. On the other hand, if Carlsen wants to play with an abundance of caution, if he wants to say, listen, I know that I've got some chances here, but let me eliminate all risk first, then he will be more tempted to take on e4. And that is exactly what he does. D takes e4 on the board. It doesn't mean that Magnus isn't playing for a win. The position is still exceedingly dangerous for white. And he's also asking Prag a very unpleasant question, Peter. And white's down to 9 minutes. Every one of these questions is going to take more time off of white's clock. What is this question? Well, what are you going to take on e4 with? And it's not a given that pawn takes e4 is the best move, but Prag plays it. He wants to keep his knight. He wants to keep active possibilities connected with the knight jumping to c4 and targeting both a5 and e5. I like that decision from Pragnananda.
Knights with knight e4, this was very important. He could have been in for a very unpleasant defensive task. Now d takes e4, d takes e4, exactly because this vulnerable e5, a5 pawns. I believe that it should just be enough to keep the balance. And the good news is that that knight on e7 is still completely stuck. Imagine that this knight from e7 could jump to c5. You would be saying that black is almost winning. That's the nuance we are talking about in this position. Black's other idea of eventually going knight d7, knight c5, it's also too slow. White only needs one move to get his knight to c4.
The atmosphere of this game is so intense. We've got over 120,000 watching on YouTube. A huge, huge shout out to everybody taking time out of your busy days and watching this epic 2023 World Cup final. This is the first rapid play match game. They will play a second game with the same time control with colors reversed. But obviously, if Magnus Carlsen can deal the first blow with the black pieces, Pragnananda will have to beat Magnus on demand with black. But I really, really like the fact that Prag took on e4 quickly. He left himself with 9 minutes. He left himself with a lot of time to figure out the ideal defensive setup. And if he defends with the precision that he has displayed in endgames in previous matches, I think he should be able to hold the draw here.
Yes, I also think so, but I also get some information that apparently Fabiano has a great chance. Let's get the bird's eye view.
Wow. Vasov's position is in shambles.
Yeah, now that we know that the Magnus game is a little bit slow and the situation has calmed down, this gave us a good chance to catch up. Look at that gorgeous bishop on e5, the dark squares, white's bishop on b3 completely out of the game. It's a wonderful situation for black.
It's a very one-sided position, and Caruana brings his a-pawn up to
Caruana match.
Don't even have to look more carefully at that game. It looks like Caruana has everything under control. The only alarming factor is his clock. He's down to 6 minutes. So having updated the first game of the third place matchup, let's dive back into Prag against Carlsen because it's becoming more intense, right? The clock situation is dwindling. Carlsen now below 7 minutes as he decides between the various candidate moves. What are those candidate moves? Well, rook 8 to d8 is the most obvious, but you also pointed out that c5 square. And you can't get the e7 knight to c5 efficiently, but you can bring the other knight over through d7 to c5. But Carlsen has opted for the more concrete option. He's gone rook a d8, and he's hit Prag's knight on d2.
Yes, I think that this is a very natural move because after knight c4, which kind of we most probably expect. On the other hand, white can also maybe try to keep the tension, but I do feel maybe that knight c4 is
Way too
natural.
yeah.
But what I wanted to say that after knight c4, Magnus takes on e4, and once you eliminate that e4 pawn, suddenly the knight from e7 comes to life. Black will have options to go knight d5 or knight f5, depending which pawn white is taking. Suddenly black gets a lot of activity. That's one of the most important.
No.
Very wise choice.
Indeed. So knight c4, tempting, but perhaps is even more important. And to keep it alive, you have to keep the knight on d2. To keep the knight on d2, you have to defend it. And to defend it, you have to bring the rook up from f1 to f2. There's also the move rook a to d1, but somehow, just intuitively, that strikes me as a lot more awkward. Now, rook f2, it does run into knight f6 to g4, but then the rook could slide over to e2, and you could chase that knight out of g4 with h3. So it's a little bit hard to play this move, but Prag does it again. Very precise defensive skill. Rook f2 was a very important move to keep black's initiative at bay.
Yes, super important.
But
making sure that the knight from e7 is not yet reaching. There is also another argument that now after rook f2, it's clear that white will have some trouble moving that knight from d2 to c4 because knight takes c4 might come with a tempo. And for this reason, there are some ideas like going knight c8, knight d6, but hang on, knight c8 might run into rook a f1. Isn't white threatening to hit that knight on f6? And let's not forget about the bishop on b3. There is still the pressure on the f7 pawn as well.
Yeah, Mount Krakatoa there could erupt on f7 with 3 pieces attacking that pawn. Such an easy detail to blunder because you think you're out of the woods with the queens off the board. You're never out of the woods when you're playing a player of Pragnananda's caliber. So knight c8, rook a f1. It leads to some crazy tactics there because black can play knight to g4 and try to exploit the weakness of white's first rank. But is Magnus interested in this kind of confrontation? No, he's not. He's played rook d4, but what happens if Prag still plays the move rook a to f1? What's the idea here?
Well, basically there are 2 ideas. He can rely on the defense knight e7 to g8, which is a stabilizing move, or is he planning to go for adventure with knight takes e4? I don't think it's not Magnus's style to go for such tacticals. Exactly, knight e7 to g8 on the board.
But how is he going to untangle this? You want to play b5 and expand on the queen side. Let's say Prag plays a neutral move like h3. And h3 isn't even a neutral move. You're preparing to storm the g-pawn up to g5 and kick the knight out of f6. Carlsen cannot afford to lose the f7 pawn with check. What is Magnus's intended way of untangling on the king side? Is it rook d7?
It's a big question, yes. I like the move h3, but first Prag kicks the rook away. Nice little touch. c3, so black most probably falls back to d7. Yes, on the board already.
Now rook e2 deserves attention, freeing up the knight and preparing knight c4. And he's done it. Great play by Prag here these last couple of moves. It feels like suddenly he's the one who's largely out of the woods here.
definitely has improved his
Knight
position.
மேல ஏறிச்சுன்னா
The knight is threatening to jump to c4. If black plays the move b5, which stops knight c4, then white can suddenly start rerouting his knight to f3, hitting that e5 pawn. And if black has to keep on somehow defending that e pawn with rook e8 or rook e7, white's knight might even land on g5, inserting some more pressure on the f7 pawn.
Really feels like Carlsen did not squeeze the maximum out of this endgame in the last couple of moves, but all credit to Prag. He has once again kept his composure, and he's also kept a time advantage, right? He's rebuilt those extra 2 minutes on the clock, and Carlsen probably will go b7,
Seriously?
b5 in order to cover the c4 square. He might also deploy his rook from f8 and stack it on d8, but then once again, you have to start
that
worrying
b3
about the long
bishop is
movements of the
annoying.
f7 pawn. And knight c4, which is a big problem.
Very annoying.
Yes, I somehow feel like b5 is the natural follow-up. And b5, knight f3, I would even go rook e7. I somehow sense that Magnus's idea was with this knight e7 to g8 to somehow set up this strategical idea of eventually moving that knight from f6 to d7 and the knight from g8 jumping to f6, and he has done it instantly. He goes rook e7.
And knight c4, that is begging to be played. It hits the a5 pawn. Will Magnus initiate crazy tactics there with b5? Again, that's not really congruent with his style.
Is
Magnus
this my
trying to
live
keep
group?
things
There are 7 people watching.
relatively tactics free in this endgame. Does that mean he is preparing to meet knight c4 with rook a8?
Probably, but it's extremely strange. There is this potential weakness on f7. Yes, the rook on e7 is protecting that pawn, but something tells me that this is very risky. I don't see yet the follow-up, but white's knight might be able to get to d6. Then, of course, Magnus will kick that knight away with rook d8. I'm a little bit puzzled by Magnus's choices.
It's not entirely unlikely that we get some sort of repetition of moves, right? Both players might end up being happy with a draw in this first game. From Prag's perspective, he's already survived a scare at the start of this endgame. Magnus Carlsen's scare came earlier in the middle game. But will Prag suddenly say, hey, your pieces are mighty passive all of a sudden. I'm up a minute on the clock. Let me try to press on the gas pedal. Big question, whether Prag will play knight c4. I think the answer is likely yes. But he could also make a slower improving move, like king h1 over to g1 or h3. So he's got quite a few of those improving moves in reserve that he can play if he wants to wait for Magnus to put his cards on the table. And he makes one of those moves. Bishop drops back to c2, overprotecting the e4 pawn.
That's a little bit of a surprise because we kind of talked about the pressure on the f7 pawn. On the other hand, probably Prag has sensed that black has enough defenses. Knight d7 played. Exactly, Magnus is trying to reroute his knights. But is it not the right time to jump knight c4? Attacking that pawn, and now it's a different story because after rook a8, we might be able to jump knight d6. Black isn't able to kick that knight immediately out of the game, and if you follow up with the natural knight c5, we might be able to start asking some question to that pawn on f7. Very interesting endgame. On the board.
On the board, knight c4 and rook a8. Although even in that final position we were analyzing, black's rook could go from a8 back to f8. I'm just not seeing, how Prag can do more than ask questions. He can pose threats to the f7 pawn and to the b7 pawn, but it feels like Magnus has enough defensive firepower to keep everything at bay. I think the likeliest outcome here is a draw, but the situation getting more tense with every passing second. Both sides are now under 5 minutes. So this is, at this point, the equivalent of a blitz game.
You need solid structure.
Yes, and I also feel there is so much tension in the position because, yes, it does look like it's an end game, things have stabilized. Long terms, black can still be better if black somehow gets knight gf6, knight c5 in, and white is unable to use the moment for active counterplay, then slowly black will start to take over. It's a typical kind of peer defense. Yeah, it's long-term issues. Black has this lovely pawn structure. If he coordinates forces, then after all, let's not forget that white has 3 pawn islands and black only has 2, and the knights will work beautifully
நிறைய டைம்
together.
சொல்றேன் பான் ஐலாண்ட்
Magnus has already converted a couple of slight advantages in the endgame in typical Magnus style. He did it on demand against Vincent Keimer to win the second match game and force a Raipa tiebreak. He did it in the second match game against Vasily Ivanchuk in a position that many thought would end surely in a draw. That would have won in the match, but the fact remains Carlsen has shown a lot of endgame prowess in this tournament. Prag, he knows that he cannot relax, he cannot make a couple of lazy moves and give Carlsen's knights more activity. And G4, what a committal decision by Prag. The engine doesn't like it. He's trying to drive the pawn up to G5 and restrict the knight on G8. But what if Carlsen drops into F6 and hits that pawn?
Yes, and provokes G5, then the knight jumps to H5. Suddenly there will be a very lovely spot on F4. Clearly, Prag relies on some knight x e5 tactic that the knight on F4 will not be able to sit there forever, but then black might get the E5 square for the other knight. Strategically, this is a very common decision.
And after knight Gf6, the knight could actually drop back to H7 and then either backward to F8 or forward to G5 and eventually try to plant itself on F4. But Magnus, he plays pawn to F6 rather than knight F6. That is a huge surprise to me.
A very big surprise. Basically, I feel that it plays into white's hand. Clearly, Magnus is hoping to go knight H6 and knight F7.
G5.
Exactly, and Prag jumps on the possibility. He instantly played the move rook G2, making sure that he will be able to meet knight H6 with G5.
A very risky move, followed by an incredibly alert reaction by Prag. Knight H6, H5, and you need to play it now, because if the knight gets back to F7, then black institutes that clamp on the G5 square. And the worst case scenario for white is if you allow that knight to reach F4. That is the promised land. You have to open up the position in order to prevent that from happening. This position is going to keep sharpening up, especially if Prag carries out the G5 pawn break, which seems very likely given what he's just played.
Exactly, I think this is what he had in his mind when he opted for G4. Can we talk about mutual hallucination or believing each other that the possibility of knight G8 to F6 was somehow missed by both players? Sometimes in the heat of the battle it can happen. And F6 rook G2 on the board. Now white has everything under control. One can forget about G4 being a question mark. G4 was a very good move if black had to be if black had to play the
Come on,
F6.
please. Come on, code
And
now.
Magnus can't stop the progress of the pawn by playing G5 himself, because the medicine is way worse than the disease. That would create a massive hole on F5. White could play knight D6, knight E3.
இவன் எனக்கு
Knight
பேசுறதுக்கு
D6 would
பெருசா
carry
இல்லை
a double attack on the
இவனுங்க
B7
ரொம்ப
pawn and the
பண்றானுங்க
F5 square. So Magnus will have to allow Prag to open up the king side with G5. He's investing a lot of time here. He's down to 2.5 minutes, and he finally decides on knight H6. Prag very likely to play G5 here and launch an all-out assault on that G6 pawn, which will be made a lot more vulnerable by the fact that the G file will open up.
Yeah, however he's posing, he's not blitzing out. We assume that he will be very happy that he gets the chance of playing G5. And G5, F take G5, rook take G5, knight F7, that's the move that also gives black a lot of stability. The knight comes with a tempo, hits the rook on G5, and the rook falls back to G3. As you indicated, there will be a pressure on the G6 pawn. Also, this knight D6, knight F5 ideas are there, but things are heating up. G5 on the board.
Yep. And we have that position. Takes and knight F7. As you were just showing, Peter, the G5, and it drops back to G2. And I thought that rook G3 made a little bit more sense, but maybe Prag trying to bring his rook all the way back away from the influence of black's knights.
Yeah, rook G3 looked a bit more natural, but okay, if you are in blitz mode, rook E6 played by Magnus as well, making sure that the D6 square is beautifully protected by the knight on F7, rook on E6. Rook also protects the pawn on G6, and eventually setting up this very nice little rook f6. We have already seen the move queen f6, which had such a big impact on the game. I do believe that rook f6, also combined with some knight f8 defending the g6 pawn, is a wonderful rerouting for black.
The initiative has changed hands several times in this endgame, but that doesn't mean it can't change hands again. Prag now down to 2.5 minutes. And if black's knights get active, there is still that f4 square, there is still the d file, and there is still the rook on a8, which has not made its presence felt just yet.
Yeah.
But if Prag takes his foot off the gas pedal and he lets black's knights get active, it's so hard to deal with a pair of active knights in time pressure. The move bishop b3 comes to mind, but case in point, you might be running into potentially knight d7 to c5. Although there are some tactics with rook takes f7 and knight takes e5. All of that has to be calculated carefully. And Prag now under 2 minutes. You can sense the anxiety. Both players locked in concentration.
Yeah, very critical moment. It's if someone just looks at the evaluation bar and sees 0-0, he does not get the sense, the real feel for this position. This position has so much spice. There is so lot of finesses. Very crucial decisions for both sides in the next couple of moves.
Rook d2 hitting the knight directly. The knight can move, but Carlsen could also meet fire with fire. He could slide his rook to f6 nonetheless, and he does. And he offers an exchange of rooks that seems to be in black's favor.
Sensational play. Basically, rook e6 was connected with this rook f6. He had to force it at the rook move, rook d2, which hits the knight. Will be met by rook f6. Everything else would have run into some tactical issues. Amazing play by Magnus.
Prag now down to a minute on the clock. He's suddenly down 2 minutes, which could become really important as this endgame continues to sharpen up. White has several ways to keep the rooks on the board. He can double on the d file. He can play rook f to d1, but then you have to reckon with the black knight getting super active on c5, and White's king is not entirely safe. The rook from a8 could later on, it could slide to the h file and start exerting pressure on h2. 40 seconds for Pragnananda as he exchanges rooks, tries to simplify the position. I like that decision.
There will be a pressure.
I think it was the correct call. It's not about fighting for initiative. You just have to make sure that in time trouble with 40 seconds on the clock, you have things under control. Maybe even go b4. Yes, b4
Excellent
on the board.
Move. He is trying to simplify things by force. Exchange pawns, make this position easier to play, easier to handle with less than a minute on the clock. And Peter, he's built up 20 very important seconds with his last 2 moves.
Yeah, creates counterplay. Also signals Magnus that, you know, you still have that b7 pawn, and if I gonna get the pawn to a5, if I ever take that pawn on b7, then the a pawn will be way too powerful. This puts Magnus also on alert. I don't think that he can afford to play for the initiative. It might be that it's a dynamic balance.
And if he plays the move b5 himself, he runs into knight to b6 followed by a5. So it's entirely possible for black to lose control of this game. And I love Prag's last move, b2, b4, remaining on top and creating practical pressure on black's king.
This is going to be draw.
Routes his king toward the center.
Yeah, he's probably setting up ideas like king e7, rook d8, trying to trade rooks. Is that a possibility, or is he thinking that if I have the king on e7, making sure that the anti-squares d7, d6 are well covered, then maybe I will be able to activate my rook on the h file? Is he hoping for some counterplay?
Prag
Very
doing
tense.
the same. He brings his own king up toward the center, and maybe trying to overprotect the e4 pawn with king f3. First, he plays a5, fixing the queenside pawns, fixing the pawn on b7 for a rainy day. And Carlsen, we mentioned this move earlier. He brings his rook to the other side of the board, and he's starting to exert pressure on Prag's king side. That rook can dive into h4 and hit e4, and black's knights are rearing to get even more active. This could get out of control for Prag, who's down to 20 seconds now on the clock.
Yeah,
He's
under some
hesitating.
pressure. Yeah, it's never easy to start defending something with little
10
time on the clock.
seconds. He's got to move, and he does get 10
He's
seconds
coming
added to
here.
his clock per move, but the situation is starting to deteriorate just a little bit. Knight h5, Uh-oh, and the knight getting to f4. This is getting scary for Prag.
The king g2 move was very unfortunate. Now he has to sidestep from the fork. King g1 played.
Knight f4, Magnus sensing the moment, and the other knight can jump into g5, creating fork threats, maybe even some mate threats in some situations. Uh-oh.
Just in a couple of... and Prag down to 8 seconds.
Look at the speed with which Carlsen is moving. Every piece becoming more and more active. The rook coming into h3. It can drive into c3. And suddenly there are all these forks that Prag has to keep in mind. He's got 6 seconds. And a6, a very panicky reaction as he gives up a pawn.
Yeah, it is a panicky reaction because knight a5 can be met by rook c3. Also bishop a4 can be met by rook c6.
Crucial situation reload பண்ணிட்டேன்டா மன்னிச்சுங்கடா boys.
g5 might be crushing because if white takes on e5, black's king just moves up to e6, forces the knight out of e5, and then knight f3 will fork the rook and the king. And Magnus doesn't see it. He plays rook c3, but knight g5 now is even stronger. And he plays it. And this is almost over.
This is over, yes, because knight takes c6 can be met by rook takes c6, bishop c6, knight f3 fork. Prag in a lot of trouble.
Knight f3, the knights are running amok. White's counterplay on the queen side has not amounted to anything. And Carlsen has left himself with 3 whole minutes on the clock to figure out the last couple of touches here. Black is completely winning here, but Prag will continue to fight until the last drop of blood. He tries to get the rooks off the board, but Carlsen can play rook a3, and there's got to be some sort of a checkmating mechanism here. Knight h3 and rook a3 wins the game. It wins a piece.
Exactly. And Magnus pauses because he knows exactly that, yes, this is it. Let me just be precise. And yes, on the board, knight g5 to h3 check. No matter where white is going, king f1 or king h1 will have the same problem that rook a3 will follow with a double attack on the bishop and rook a1 checkmate the knight. Just monster knights.
And it took Carlsen so much time and so much finesse to get those knights to where they are. It took a lot of turnarounds and the initiative changed hands. But Carlsen laughs last, and he will laugh longest in this first game. He will just move his king to f6, getting away from the checks. And the threat of rook a1 checkmate and rook takes a4 forces Pragnananda to resign the first game. And you can see there a dejected Prag will not have a lot of time to marinate on this game because he has a task in front of him, and that is to win the next game with the black pieces, Peter.
Yeah, it's a mammoth task. We have to give credit for Magnus sensationally sensing the moment, and that king march with king f8, king e7 prepared his activation of his rook, and once the rook activated itself, then the knights were jumping. What a big victory for Magnus Carlsen.
There is a reason he is often called the greatest endgame player of all time. The way that he's able to seize the initiative to apply
லாஸ்ட்ல வந்து எல்லாத்தையும் கடைசில
Prag playing such a good game. This could have gone either way. And while Prag fans will be disappointed, he played excellently. And this game came down to the final time scramble. He will have to win the next game to force the Blitz playoffs. You can see Fabiano Caruana also won the game with the black pieces. And Nijat Abbasov in a similar predicament to Pragnananda. 2 Herculean tasks will have to be put together, Peter, by Abbasov and, of course, by Prag.
First of all, they have to forget what happened in the first game. That's the step number 1, the most important one. Clearly very difficult. They have like 10 minutes break between the games. Also, they need to adjust their strategy because they were definitely counting on with white will at least make a draw, and with black we want to be solid. That's not the case anymore. They will have to make crazy decisions in the opening and try to go for the maximum right from the start.
With a draw or a victory, Magnus Carlsen wins his first World Cup, and Pragnananda's incredible run will come to an end. He will have to settle for runner-up, but that is only one possible reality. With a victory with the black pieces, Prag and Abbasov will force this match to keep going. There's only one way to find out which of these narratives, which of these storylines we will be telling after the next game.
No.
We had around 200,000 of you watching across the platforms, and the best part is yet to come. We will have the second game of the Rapid Tiebreaker coming for you on the other side of the break. But first, we're going to take a couple of minutes. When we come back, we will set the stage for the second and possibly decisive game of the 2023 World Cup.
Welcome, everyone. We are here with Judith Polgar, the legendary chess player, one of the greatest chess players of all time.
And I went my next move. I said, no, I'm not moving my queen. I'm not moving my bishop. But actually, I'm going to give checkmate or winning great material. And I went knight e3. It works only that way. If you're attacker, you sacrifice something, go all the way until the end. Don't chicken out in the meantime at some point, because many times there is a point there is no way back. It's only forward. How is it to play with Kasparov? When you saw him personally, he really had this incredible energy.
Judith, thank you so much for being with us, and I hope you're ready to dive into the past with us.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very happy to share with you some of my most memorable games.
I am working on my வேகமா ஆடிட்டு இருக்கேன்.
Every second counts.
Hikaru Nakamura is surviving.
We're working 8. Whoa! He blundered his queen. He's got 40 more seconds. He needs to burn. Rookie's losing. Oh my god, he's gonna flag! No! He flagged! He flagged! He flagged! Oh my god! He made him! Oh my god!
Strong there, wait! Oh, get over the board!
He's just gonna move quickly.
Oh! Oh my gosh!
Oh my god. யாரும் பார்க்கல. இன்னும் ஒரு கேம் இருக்கு. இந்த கேம்ல பாஸ் ஜெயிச்சாச்சுன்னா we have another game. இதுல போச்சுன்னா முடிச்சு. ஆனா பட் இதுல ஜெயிக்கிறதுக்கான வாய்ப்புகள் கொஞ்சம் அதிகம். ஏன்னா இட்ஸ் ரேபிட் டக்கு டக்குன்னு பண்ற மாதிரியான கேம் இது இப்போ வரப்போறது.